Welcome back to Tomorrow Today, the podcast for your future fears and greatest aspirations or something.
Your favorite aspirations, your worst fears, your worst aspirations.
Your favorite fears, your worst aspirations.
Ooh, your favorite fears. Welcome to the podcast for your favorite fears.
And your worst aspirations.
And your worst one. Be the worst version of yourself in the future. That should be the new tag.
Yeah, I think it would catch on.
Tomorrow Today, be the worst version of yourself. I'm your host, Nash Flynn, a very appropriate host for this podcast.
So today we are talking about one of my favorite subjects.
Oh, God. Collapse.
And it rhymes with horn.
Porn? Oh, yeah.
No,
Right.
It's corn.
Why
Cornhub. You know it. It's coming.
Why would you build me up, Buttercup, only to bring me down?
Because it's your worst... What the fuck did we say?
It's worst aspirations.
It's your worst aspirations, Nash. All right, so let me start with this. What do you know about corn?
Okay, well, truthfully,
I know you know what it rhymes with.
Well, yes, I know what it rhymes with. Also, the only other thing I know about corn is unfortunately informed by the Austin Powers movie, in which we don't digest corn, right?
I mean, Aqua Teen covered that too. But everyone knows sweet corn, right? And then, like, the corn on the cob.
Oh, is that sweet corn? Okay.
Yeah, and then there's, like, the ubiquitous corn that, like, livestock feed, the big monocrops, like when people are like talking about like corn monocrops, they're not talking about like just a lot of people shucking corn during the summer. Like that's not what that's about, right?
Oh, I see. I thought those were the same.
You were just like, man, big corn country out there where they're just like plowing through sleeves of kerneled
I did
corn.
think that. So now I feel silly.
Okay, that is not what they're talking about.
Oh,
they're talking about what's called dent corn. And dent corn is this hard, high-protein, very storable seed. The kernels, rather, are seeds. But this corn is, like, very good at storing. Like, it's very much similar in terms of, like, its capacity to be stored as, like, barley or grain, any other, like, seed that we would use for flour. And that's why you have things like corn tortillas and things like that. That all comes from the dent corn. Just really versatile corn, basically.
Does it pop?
Is it corn pop? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm asking if
I have
can
to call Joe?
Turn it into popcorn.
Different corn. This corn is the thing that over the last 70 years has basically taken over the American diet. And because of our relationship with food and that it's not tied, at least here in the United States, to who we are in our identity as generic white people that live here.
Sure.
We don't see how our diet has changed as quickly as if we were living in places like where our ancestors lived, where those foods were tied to tradition, and you could see that through linear history and its relationship to the place where you live. Because we live in a place where that's not the case, we've been really disconnected from where our food comes from, and in a very short period of time, we've lost how quickly our food has basically evolved. And today, between the corn that's grown, and I'm going to say something that's not actually 100% accurate, but the corn that's grown today is grown for feeding livestock and producing corn oil and ethanol and this base for most of our diet because it's in everything, high fructose corn syrup and so on. This corn has just completely filled in every orifice of... Listen, I'm going with the porn theme, all right?
Oh, I understood.
So it fills every, like, vacancy that can be found in our food system. Over the last 70 years, they got really good at breeding corn. The guest we have on today goes into a lot of detail on why and how that happened. While that's not the main point of her book, understanding how we got to where we are today and why the research that she was doing is super important, we have to understand this, like, very basic evolution of our food system. And that's basically framed up in this idea that we got really good at growing corn and then we just shoved it into everything trying to find a use for it. It was like, let's grow the calories now because humans have always lived like right on the precipice of not having enough calories. We'll figure out how to use it later.
Right.
And that's what we did. So Helen Anne Curry, she is a researcher. She's actually taking a new position at Georgia Tech as a professor of history of technology, has written a number of books on genetics and specifically around food systems. And her book that we discuss extensively is called Endangered Maize. And the premise of it was that back in the 50s and 60s, as breeding these hybrid varieties of corn that were super productive, we started to see that we were thinning the genetic diversity of corn. And all it would take is, one wrong virus, one wrong whatever, and our whole food system could basically come crashing down. Researchers became incredibly aware that corn is this incredibly diverse plant that exists in all of these indigenous communities across North and South America. And they basically went to the ends of the earth to find them all, or at least as many as they could. And there's this really complicated history that we start talking about between nonprofits stepping in to get involved and to fund these research efforts, and governments and corporations. And we start to talk a little bit about this idea of like the ownership of genetic data and what the implications of all these things are, and kind of where our food system goes from where we are today. If something's 40-50% of our diets, we should probably know if that's something that we can believe is going to be there in the future, right?
You started talking about having these monocrops or things that people survive on, and I automatically go to the Irish famine, the Great Hunger in Ireland in the 1840s.
Worked out great.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, we have sort of the same ecosystem for that scenario, whereas you have a population that relies predominantly on one food source, and you have colonialism.
Which always goes well together.
Right.
Like lamb and tuna fish.
Exactly. Like industry and colonialism and a reliance on one food crop that has sort of been a one strain of food crop. You have one blight that takes out that food crop, and you're looking at crazy amounts of mortality just across the board. So
listen, this time's different.
This is a worst aspiration podcast.
This is a worst aspiration. We said, you know what? Let's take the potato famine and let's make it bigger.
Right.
How big can we go? Those are rookie numbers.
Let's take everything we learned from the Great Hunger in Ireland, and also what we learned about overbreeding pugs, and just smash that into one world experiment.
The pugtato?
Okay.
Sorry, it's not a corn-related one, but just think about it, like shoving a pug's face on a potato. It doesn't actually look that much different when you think about it.
Not a good enough excuse to use the word shoving.
Pugtato, come on.
When we thought this episode was about porn, it ended up being super depressing and about famines. So.
And oddly shaped pugtatoes. Think about how many eyes there are in that pug.
Don't like that at all. I wish you could go back and unsay that.
Do you feel like you know a little bit more about food?
I feel like I'm terrified.
You should be. I think you're going to have to listen to this interview.
I think I'm going to.
You should.
Right now.
That's what we do.
Let's go. Play it for me. Play us off, Jack.
Helen, thanks so much for coming on. Could you introduce yourself for us and maybe tell us how you ended up basically deciding to hole yourself away and write this very in-depth and thorough book on the history of corn, and maybe why you decided it was so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, first of all, for inviting me to be here and to be talking about the book and about my research with you. I'm really delighted at the opportunity. I'm Helen Anne Curry. I've just taken a position as the Kranzberg Professor of the History of Technology at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. I'm an academic who's spent a lot of time thinking about the history of environment and agriculture, with a particular interest in and an emphasis on crop development and plant breeding, whether that's biotechnology or, a focus on heritage grains, or as in my recent work, thinking about the conservation of crop diversity and how it involves both of those activities, both breeding and a focus on history and heritage. Yeah, so how did I come to the topic of the conservation of crop diversity and in particular maize diversity, which is the subject of my recent book? I think the answer to that question really starts with an interest that I had, curiosity that I had in the seed storage facilities that we typically refer to as seed banks. So while I was working on other research, I kept coming across seed banks as pivotal institutions for contemporary crop science, research, agricultural development. And I got interested more in what they really were, what kind of work they were doing. Perhaps also motivated in some ways by, if you're at all familiar with seed banks, you're probably familiar with the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which opened for its first acceptance of donations in 2008, I think, and which at the time that I was pursuing some earlier research was really starting to dominate the headlines, at least in the corner of the news world that I tend to track. So I had this interest in figuring out what it is that seed banks are and what they do, what is the conservation mission that they've been asked to carry out. And as I explored more into the history of seed banks, I came to have a set of questions really about conservation more generally. When and why did people start worrying about the loss of diversity in crops? And what different kinds of solutions did they see as relevant to addressing that concern? Solutions that include seed banks and different kinds of germplasm storage facilities like seed banks, but other approaches besides, everything from subsidizing farmers to continue to grow certain kinds of crops, to community seed exchanges, to efforts to change the way that people eat and the things that they might think about consuming. So I got interested in many different concerns related to the loss of crop diversity and many different kinds of conservation imagined or different kinds of practices imagined to be relevant to that conservation activity. And then I think there's one further element to explain about the book that eventually took shape from this research interest, which is the focus on maize. I found early on in the project that actually this was a huge set of questions and issues to be tackling, and there needed to be a thread to navigate through it. And I really came to think that there was a kind of preponderance of work and energy and interest that took shape around maize or corn from pretty early in the 20th century onwards, particularly in the US context and also the Mexican context, which I address in the book, perhaps for reasons that we'll discuss further in this conversation. But maize was really the focus of significant conservation attention from early on and continuing through today in ways that let me tell a story that has features that apply more generally to the conservation of crop diversity, and through some of the kind of path-breaking moments in that history generally. So the establishment of seed storage facilities dedicated to conservation, to some of the pioneering work around community-oriented seed saving and conservation in efforts in which really maize was a central concern. And so it was both a sort of uniquely important crop in the conservation of crop diversity that let me hit many different points, but also illuminated a kind of more general story.
Yeah, it was a really thorough and fascinating look at a crop that I thought I was pretty knowledgeable about, and then I was just like, I don't know anything. and that's really cool, like to be able to say, like, you get to these points where you don't know what you don't know, and you get overconfident, or you get confident, I guess, and then this whole other scope of knowledge comes in, and you're like, oh wow, there's so much more to learn about this thing that I'm interested in, and I never thought about it from these perspectives. And it's really important to acknowledge those exist, but it's really hard at the same time to not know what you don't know. So this book was really illuminating for me. So I appreciate it from that perspective.
No, thanks for sharing that.
Now, I think I think part of the world we live in, because of our disconnection from where our food comes from, we've very quickly been able to ignore the fact that the way our diets have shifted over the last 100 years have really evolved around corn. And in some ways that's been really great in the sense that it's allowed people to move off of farms and to do things that they're passionate about, or at least create new markets, new products and things that we think are important. At the same time, that process that's freed us from having to live and subsist on farms and things like that has also made things more precarious, specifically around the breeding genetics. Now, could you explain this a little bit? You talk about it in the book, but even as somebody that is around, I don't do a lot of breeding, So it's a little confusing even for me.
Yeah, sure. So feel free here to interrupt me and push me in different directions if there's different parts of this story that you want to know about. But I think one way to get at the issues that you've just raised is to point to some of the constraints that come along with scaling up production, right? So one of the reasons that we've been able to produce so much more per acre of farmland of various different crops, including corn, over, say, the past half century plus, maybe the past 70 years, is to do with genetic enhancements that enable crops to be more productive, whether that's because they're responding to fertilizers in a particular way or dealing with crowding in a particular way, right? Responding to their environment in such a way that yields are able to be maintained or go up even as conditions shift around them. And so what we refer to as genetic gains as a result of plant breeding have gone along with other things that I think people are more familiar with. So the use of synthetic chemical fertilizers or pesticides or insecticides, right? So controlling the environment at which crops grow in these very obvious ways to most of us has also been accompanied by a process that's much more hidden, I think. And that's what you're referring to, these things that go on that we're not necessarily as aware of. But in attempting to control both the environment that crops grow in, as well as the internal material, right, the genetics of the plants themselves, the sort of pathway of industrialization tends to push towards both environments and genetics that are ever more similar over time, right? So in the scope of the genetics of plants, people talk about a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck that historically has accompanied plant breeding, in which superior individuals or plants that perform best are selected for in terms of the genetic material that they contain, and that they tend also to be grown more because of their performance ability or because of the ways in which they're marketed. So we end up with plants that are ever more kind of genetically similar within a particular variety, but then also grown over or sort of across varieties, I guess, but then also grown over wider areas, right? So sort of both in terms of genetically similar, basically at different scales of ecosystems and environments, I think. And that is the kind of precarity that you referred to. There are many people who think that certain kinds of genetic narrowing eliminate variability that might be useful if there are either catastrophic weather events or disease events or changes in climate that change the pressures on growing crops in different sorts of ways. Because when you have populations that are very genetically similar, you have reason to expect that they're all going to behave the same, as opposed to maybe populations that came before that were more heterogeneous. And so we have made plants incredibly more productive over time, but it isn't without a worry that some of that productivity brings with it a risk of potential kind of losses or catastrophes in the future based around this kind of uniformity.
And all of this kind of stems from a number of different things, from the Dust Bowl and the Cold War and all of these. It's kind of a perfect storm of things that came together between the researchers getting better at this type of work and like all these other outside forces that really created kind of the conditions that allowed for what became this race to try to quote unquote save indigenous species. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this process, or this idea of like hyper specialized plants that are incredibly productive, is that the further that they get from the other varieties, trying to breed those other varieties with these characteristics, these traits that may help them in the future, becomes harder and harder because of the difference in yields that each of those plants has. And it seems like in a way where, and this is probably more philosophical than scientific, I guess, but that we're getting further and further away as these plants become more productive from being able to breed them these genetics in, because of how further and further apart they've become from the landrace varieties, or whatever term you want to use to describe some of these other corns that don't fit the super productive American style commercial crops.
Yeah, I think there's a couple interesting things to say about that. One is there's some research that's been done that suggests that had open pollinated varieties of maize received the same amount of attention that hybrid development did. Hybrid was preferred by commercial producers because it allowed them more control over seed production and reuse. Yeah, as much attention had been put into open pollinated corn development as into hybrid corn development, we would have seen open pollinated varieties that were more competitive, just because of the ability of breeding to generate varieties so that would perform better over time. And so one of the reasons that hybrid corn is so productive is simply because it was the subject to so much resources and inputs and intellectual activity. But it needn't have been the case that it outperformed to such an incredible extent the open pollinated varieties that came before. So that is one thing that I think there's actually continues to be good research coming out on what those genetic differences, that potential difference really is. But the other thing to say is that I think there is actually it's an interesting area in which there's a lot of optimism right now. This is something that I don't touch on at all in the book. Is about the possibility of genomic science and gene editing to overcome some of these barriers to using land races or farmer varieties, whatever your favorite designation of those that have been less subject to professional or commercial breeding activity, that with the ability to, for example, run the sequence of a genome on different samples to see what the genetic signature is and to think about combinations of crops at that level. But then especially to be able to use things like gene editing tools like CRISPR-Cas9 to actually kind of toggle the genetic material much more precisely. And it would depend on how one feels about gene editing as a biotechnology, obviously. People have mixed feelings about that. But some of the real kind of gaps that might exist right now between, say, an industrial hybrid corn and an open pollinated landrace that's not been subject historically to the same kind of concentrated productivity-oriented attention, some of that gap might actually be able to be bridged in a way that was not possible in recent past. And so for what it's worth, some of this trajectory that we've seen could potentially be overcome if people were interested in using the technologies to do that.
Yeah, and it points to something I think that's really difficult for people to discern, which is the difference between the technology and the proprietors of the technology sometimes. So, we're talking about hybrid corns and how they've been bred so far away from traditional landrace varieties, and people justifiably are suspicious of technologies and science that comes from proprietary technology and how that's traditionally been utilized for corporate gain and not for the benefit of the general public. I mean, we are where we are in terms of climate change because of oil companies doing basically the same thing. So it becomes really difficult to say, hey, listen, when we're talking about things like GMOs or whatever term you want to use, they're not inherently evil. It offers us different tools, and we have to understand those tools within the context and confines of what they are and disconnected from some of the negative connotations that come with them because of how they've been leveraged and utilized. And I think because of that, people get really suspicious and uncomfortable with that conversation of, okay, yes, these things may be considered dangerous, whether it's in your own book, you talk about Chiapas and the Zapatistas and their concerns about the pollination from the commercial strains, their own indigenous crops. They have every reason to be suspicious and concerned, even if it isn't inherently the technology itself that's the problem.
You're absolutely right. I think that intellectual property is the sort of central issue in crop biotechnologies and why they have proved so enduringly controversial. I mean, I think the early activism around this, especially in the 1970s and 80s, was spurred on not so much by dangers of the technology in terms of biological consequences, but really in terms of the social justice consequences of owning crop, having ownership over seeds in a very strict way that would be enabled or facilitated further by biotechnological development, and indeed was, as we've seen. And so, but to my mind, that really points to, and many other people have said this as well, right? Thinking about the parallel trajectory of industrial seed development and the paring down of publicly funded programs for crop development. I think there's a kind of interesting set of work that could be done looking at what happened to public breeding programs over the course of the 20th century. It's not something I've necessarily undertaken. And thinking about how that relates to crop diversity. If we don't have, people who are given the job of working in the public interest to develop crop varieties, be it with biotechnology, gene editing, right, or quote unquote more traditional methods, you might actually see the existence of those programs, if they had been maintained, could have been associated with perhaps a different crop landscape than we have today.
And I think that's where the commodification of corn and its unique characteristics as a C4 grass that can evolve incredibly quickly comparatively to even, if we look at wheat, which you talk about a bit in the book, as a crop that's also been treated very similarly in terms of development and hybridization and things like that. The amount of productivity that's come out of corn versus two-row barley is incredibly different because of corn's ability to just produce incredible amounts of calories. And one of the things I've actually heard you on another podcast talk about is that people will they'll talk about things like, okay, we're growing this corn for livestock, we're making seed oils, we're doing all these things, and that's what's driving the productivity or the usage of corn as this massive monocrop. But that kind of is the flip side of it, is we're really good at producing it, and then we're trying to find ways to use it instead, because we are so good at creating calories. And historically speaking, humans have always existed, or at least in, I guess, the modern era, and I'll use modern as in, I guess, like industrial era, pre-industrial era, recorded history era, as subsistence and slightly more, maybe. Whereas today, because of corn, we are not in that place. We're able to produce far more calories than we've ever needed, and it's kind of hard to shake the idea that we should be not growing it if we can.
Yeah, no, I think you've captured some of the challenges there. The push after World War II, especially to increase global grain production, especially the drive to develop agriculture in other places on the model, especially seen in the United States, but also elsewhere, Canada, and beyond. That ever increasing pile of grain is in many ways as much a burden as it is something to celebrate in. And if we think about how diets have changed in relation to industrial food products and the health consequences of some of those shifts, a lot of people do point back to the emphasis on breeding high-yielding varieties that would respond to synthetic fertilizers in the immediate sort of 1940s, 1950s post-war period, and the incredible successes seen in driving up productivity of wheat. Corn obviously has a sort of history that starts a little bit earlier in the United States, but yeah, and I think, it's important to remember that the fear of hunger and the devastation of famine was and is real, right? I think we need to be attending to agricultural production and ensuring that we're always kind of advancing the front of productivity. But a lot of the problems remain in distribution and how grain gets used and in what governments are willing to exchange grains for and so on. Yeah, this kind of immense productivity hasn't necessarily meant resolution of the problems that it was originally targeting.
You touch on it in the book and you don't go into too much detail, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. You mention a lot about the Rockefeller Foundation and a little bit about the Ford Foundation and a couple other nonprofits that have existed to advocate on behalf of the Green Revolution, as you talk about it in the book. And we've seen that get replicated with similar failures in India and in Africa today with the inclusion of like the Gates Foundation, which has come with a number of challenges. First, could you kind of summarize maybe a little bit about what the Green Revolution was in Mexico, and then maybe kind of some of your thoughts on maybe stuff that you didn't necessarily cover in the book, but thought was really interesting, or areas for further exploration around the subject area?
Sure. So when people talk about the Green Revolution with a capital G and a capital R, they're usually referring to this, or historically, that was a phrase used to refer to a transition in agricultural productivity seen in parts of Asia and the Middle East, and then also Mexico and a bit of elsewhere in Latin America in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And these were agricultural productivity increases tied specifically to the introduction of new varieties, which were kind of often referred to as high-yielding varieties. That mostly meant that they were varieties that were very responsive to fertilizer and had been bred to use fertilizer in a kind of efficient way. And then also to the kind of, the Green Revolution could also, in productivity, could also be attributed to other elements of what's called a technological package that were put in place at the same time. So it wasn't just seeds and fertilizer, but also in some cases irrigation systems or possibilities. Also credit schemes for farmers to be able to borrow the money they might need to obtain all these tools. In some cases, mechanization of farming as well. And the Green Revolution, as it in that sort of narrow sense, as it unfolded in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was claimed by, I would say, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundations as a product of philanthropic investment in research for agricultural development, research to create varieties, work on extension and bringing those varieties to communities, and so on. And so there was a sort of a narrative solidified early on in the early 1970s about how philanthropy had created the possibilities for agricultural transformation, which it was then assumed would also bring social transformation, new possibilities, new opportunities. But that was a narrative that was almost immediately contested and remains contested today. You also have in the early 1970s, the first ever kind of social scientist and environmental or ecological studies that come in and say, oh, actually, the introduction of these seeds, these technologies, these new ways of obtaining credit and resources to farm have created new inequalities among farmers. They've created new environmental challenges, for example, with fertilizer runoff, maybe with loss of crop diversity. And so even as the sort of celebration of the Green Revolution as solving looming crises of hunger, of malnutrition, even as that was being declared and put forward, there was a body of literature that was saying, oh no, the Green Revolution is something to be upset about, something to condemn, not something to celebrate. And really those two pathways of understanding this history and what it means to undergo this specific kind of agricultural transformation, I think that remains a contest, right, over which of those narratives better. My own view is that it's a little bit of both, but we can come back to that. But I think as those debates over what the Green Revolution was and whether it was good or bad unfolded, that narrow Green Revolution that I just described as a sort of particular historical event, Green Revolution has come to have a more general meaning in which people refer to green revolutions. What happened elsewhere in South America or in Central America, what happened in Korea, or what happened in, well, as you already mentioned in your comment, what was attempted to be implemented in Africa. People talk about a green revolution for Africa. And so there is a sense in which any agricultural transformation that involves these elements of seeds and fertilizer and a certain kind of what we often refer to as modernization, a loaded term in many ways, those are all kind of packaged as green revolutions of a kind. I think the dialogue continues as to the desirability of green revolutions on the model of the green revolution of the 1960s and 70s. And so I think if you asked about other things to other research pathways to take within that history. I mean, obviously, there's work to be done on thinking through the many efforts that have been made to undertake agricultural transformations in Africa as a part of development aid programs that really have never produced the kind of outcomes that have been imagined for them. And this is true from the 1970s really onwards. And there's a lot of good social science research that really pushes at trying to understand some of the limitations of developers' visions, also some of the ecological challenges. But I also think there's probably questions we should ask about the good faith efforts that have been made by many people to respond to some of those critiques arising of the Green Revolution approach, and to try and envision new ways of instituting agricultural change that's perhaps more sensitive to communities, perhaps more sensitive to gender dynamics and gender dimensions of agriculture, that's more cognizant of the long-term ecological harm that might arise from certain shifts in production, that's more incorporative of diverse agricultural elements, including crop diversity. Because a lot of those too have stumbled despite their greater social awareness, and despite, I think, really, the truly genuine good intentions behind them. And so I think we've spent a lot of time trying to unpack the Green Revolution and all of the bad things about it. But I think we need to start doing a better job. At least this is speaking as a historian and what historians have focused on. We could do a better job of also thinking through how research transformed in response to critique, in the 1970s, in the 80s, and later, and understanding the ways in which research changed and tried to address shortcomings that were pointed out. Because if we're still living with some of these problems and challenges, that seems to me essential to really understanding why we're still living with them.
I do want to talk about kind of those early stages, going back to seed saving and then working with indigenous farmers, because it does frame up some of the things you're talking about right now. But before we go there, I ended up going down a rabbit hole after I read your book on, I'm never going to pronounce his name, so I'm just going to call him his nickname, Zolo, who an instructor at the school that the seed bank was basically framed around in Chapingo. And he kind of does what you're talking about a bit, in a really interesting way. I was only able to find like a thesis that was written about it. During a student protest blockade of the school, he was kind of the facilitator between the Mexican government and the students. He was an interesting person because he had, when the government refused to give him money, he went to the Rockefeller Foundation and basically asked for money for really important research on seed saving. And he was a major proponent for agroecology, and recognizing the knowledge that indigenous farmers had, and was kind of one of the first academic voices really pushing that in Mexico. But what was really interesting is that he understood the complexity and the nuance of the conversation in a way we don't often hear about when we read books. And I think that's something you do in this book, that it's not a Green Revolution bad, indigenous farmers have no interest in these products, and that there's no place for some of the work that they're doing. Because to bring it back to the beginning of the book, you talk extensively about well-meaning and well-intentioned researchers who are, in their opinions, very justifiably concerned about keeping these indigenous land races from being lost, and how that was both appreciated and leveraged by companies. Even if the companies didn't have the indigenous farmers' best interests at heart, that doesn't mean there weren't any good things that came out of it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about. So it's Efraim Hernandez Cholocotzi, and he was a Mexican agroecologist trained in Mexico as well as the United States, employed, as you pointed out, at various times by the Rockefeller Foundation, by the Mexican government, working very much as a part of the kind of effort to advance what later became known as the Green Revolution in Mexico, and then became a strident critic of it. Trained a generation of students in agroecology in Mexico, really helped to kind of cement and advance different ideas about how agricultural development might unfold, the ways in which it might involve what he called traditional agricultural technologies, but really a kind of agricultural development in Mexico for Mexicans, right? And being cognizant of the extent to which agribusiness was dominated by non-Mexican interests, and especially non-indigenous interests. He, I think, was one of the pioneers of an alternative vision, at least in Mexico. I'm really, really pleased to hear you describe the way in which the history that I tell in the book comes across as not one of being villains and heroes, but really of the complexity that we find at any juncture, the complexity of good intentions, of structural constraints, of competing visions for what, for example, good conservation means. And I think, yeah, in a lot of debates, especially in the sort of agricultural space about like what good agriculture is, I think there's a lot of drawing of black and white lines, and we don't have a lot of space for those conversations that basically admit, no, we need to keep a lot of the elements that we have in agriculture in place, at least in terms of feeding the number of people that we have in the world. And so some of the kinds of shifts that happened around the Green Revolution are shifts that sort of enable us to go on, right? And that the changes that need to happen from here in developing an agriculture that's more sustainable moving forward is about finding some balance between how and where we use land in the ways that we do today, for example, in the Midwest, and where we make changes, either towards different crop varieties, different modes of production, and the same goes for other places in the world. Finding the places where we support big farmers and finding the places where it makes more sense to support small scale and local and smallholder farmers or subsistence farmers. I think, if there's anything, it's just really moving away from the one size fits all model to recognize that there's a whole range of models, and that range of models also includes the ways that we farm now, right? Yeah. And that's part of the future trajectory that I think we have to probably get comfortable with. But that involves accepting a sort of big gray zone in the middle, as with so many of these things. So anyway, so I'm delighted that comes through in the book. And I think the history and the biography of people like Hernandez Cholucotze really exemplify that, because of the way in which he straddled these different domains, was part of different dialogues and conversations, and the sort of complexity of his biography shows the way in which, actually the Rockefeller Foundation in its Green Revolution or pre-Green Revolution activities in Mexico funded a huge range of educational opportunities for researchers across Mexico, Central and South America. And as a result of that, transformed agricultural knowledge, including creating some of the discussions that were ultimately agroecological, right?
It's very easy to make the argument that the Rockefeller Foundation is like this anti-communist propaganda machine that allows American companies to go into peripheral countries, third world countries, whatever term that people decide to use. And like that might be true, but also like good things can come out of that. It might not all be good, but good things, and we can't just erase those good things just because bad things came with them. And in terms of like the way we do agriculture today, we have to be able to say, okay, well, if our goal isn't to make everyone go back to farming, we have to find what is the highest capacity we can do with the least ecological destruction. And that means using all the tools that exist around us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would also say some of this sort of inhabiting the muddled middle zone applies to the history of seed banking, which, as I said, is what originally brought me to this work. Because as I emphasize in the book, I think seed banks have been at best a kind of partial conservation solution, that putting things in cold storage in the way that began happening, from the 1930s and 40s onwards, that the cold storage trajectory enabled a certain kind of security or a sort of vision of security, but also created new insecurities. So things wouldn't necessarily disappear forever if they went out of cultivation in the fields, but once stored in the seed bank required new kinds of conservation stewardship, the difficulties of which only became apparent over time, and I think in many ways are still becoming apparent. So one of the reasons that the Svalbard Global Seed Vault exists as an entity is because seed banks, as they were established all over the world in the 50s and 60s and 70s, came to be seen as actually quite vulnerable, and themselves not safe storage spaces. So Hence, we have an even bigger freezer than ever, basically, in the Arctic, that now keeps most of the world's major seed collections and or copies of them. But at the same time, that I think it's important to recognize the limitations of seed banking. There's not a world in which I wish that they would disappear. I think we need seed banks, absolutely, right? And so it's hard not to, sort of critiquing the salvage mentality that then sees storage as a solution doesn't mean abandoning storage as an enterprise. No, it's just recognizing that it's a partial solution and it needs to be, well-resourced and well-financed, but also buttressed by other alternatives out there in the world. And so often I think, we get to the critique and seeing the shortcomings, but then, forget to say, actually, we can't live without that solution. That has to be part of the package that we have in place.
Yeah, and you talk about this a bit in the book, the sheer scope and size of actually keeping seeds in storage and like what that looks like, because of the fact that seeds can't sit indefinitely frozen and be viable. So that means taking them out, letting them grow for a year, harvesting those seeds. And you have to do it in the conditions because of the plasticity of the seeds. You have to do it in the conditions that those plants come from, or they're going to start losing those traits that are so desirable in the seeds themselves. The point you make in the book is basically, or at least from my perspective, was that seed banks are important, but that's only one part of the puzzle, and that it erases the existence of the plant as a plant that's has a place in time. And, that comes with the indigenous knowledge of growing the plant. It comes with its relationships with the things around it, the pests that try to eat the plant, and, continuously evolving alongside those things as a community. Putting it in storage in case, an entire village were to get wiped out and that crop was lost forever is important, but you're freezing that place in time. It's not continuing to exist as a dynamic piece of a community. And that's the part that was getting missed by researchers for the first probably 40 years, it seems like.
Or it was at least, the sort of priority given to that concern wasn't as great as it might have been. But those were researchers who, I think it's really important also to, sort of situate oneself in the historical imagination of being crop scientists in the 1950s, having just seen, for example, the wholesale transformation of maize production in the Midwest of the United States, right? The wholesale changeover of varieties being grown from open pollinated to hybrid. Projecting changes like that, right, forward into the future, and really feeling like there would be no space that was not transformed, and that would not be transformed actually in some cases really quite quickly. I think sitting today, we see that's not the way that agricultural transformation unfolded. But that wasn't necessarily the world that seemed apparent to some of the people who first set seed banks in motion as conservation sites. I think they might have seen the future unfolding quite differently from the way that it actually did.
I think the researchers themselves were very intimate with the knowledge of the plants and the needs of the plants and the relationships that evolved around those plants, or they wouldn't have been doing the research. They wouldn't have been doing the dirty work of going out and hiking through the jungle for miles and miles and not speaking the language and all of these barriers that made this a very uncomfortable and difficult job to do. And also with like a very precarious existence in academia or research through nonprofits or whatever, if they didn't see the whole picture. But I do think in their quest for saving these things, they kind of forgot the transience of those existences, which is, and like you said, they probably were aware of it. It just wasn't as big of a priority. The idea was like, okay, right now we're trying to stop the bleed versus like fixing things, which is, I guess, an important piece of the process. What was really amazing to me was amazing. Sorry.
No,
Stupid pun.
right.
What was amazing to me was the volume of varieties that they were able to find. I know one of the stats, I think, was like there was 2,500 different varieties of maize at one point that were cataloged in Mexico, which is just like, it's mind-blowing given like I think there's like right now like 84 varieties of peas that are available. And like that's a huge part of like the human diet because of its ability to nitrogen fix and so on. So like talking about a plant that has that volume in just one country with thousands more in South America and the United States is just, it's like beyond the scope of what we can fathom.
And I think it's important to recognize some of the discussion of, what constitutes a variety when you're looking at these populations is quite different than what gets registered as a variety, for example, of peas for sale. And when they were collecting samples, they were registering as individual samples, things that would have looked perhaps quite similar to folks not necessarily tracking differences from community to community or valley to valley. So today there are, I think the current accepted number of distinct, they're called, and it's a problematic term even as applied to maize, but they're called the races of maize, but they refer to subpopulations of the species Zea maize that are clearly distinguished genetically from each other. There are 59 of those in Mexico. So of those, thousands of samples that were collected and individually registered, researchers, the number has shifted over time, but they've agreed mostly that there are about 60 subgroups that can be aggregated from that larger number, which is still, amazing. And if you were to, and I encourage anyone listening, if you've not seen what the diversity of maize land races looks like, they range, wildly in terms of color, shape, size. They're truly distinct from one another in terms of their features, in terms of taste, in terms of where they grow and what they're good for. And I think to most of us, who maybe if you grew up in the United States eating a cob of sweet corn in the summertime, you've only really encountered the very tip of what the diversity of maize can be. And if you expand out from Mexico, obviously, to take in more of the Americas, the diversity just sort of expands from there.
So one of the things towards the end of the book is you're kind of taking a look at both the Green Revolution, folks that are fighting against it, and then you start looking at some solutions, and I'll use the term solutions kind of loosely here, to this challenge of how do we work with folks, these indigenous farmers, to give them a voice in these conversations and to support them in the sense that while these people have sustainably farmed on their landscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because of capitalism, the marketplace and all these different things, their ability to exist independently of that world is becoming harder and harder. And you highlight this with one of the conversations around giving farmers the authority and the autonomy to do some of the breeding work themselves with input from the researchers. And there's this really beautiful quote that you use, and I'm not sure if it was you or someone else, so I apologize. I should have probably written it down. And you say, social scientists placed peasant farmers and professional scientists at two ends of a continuum of knowledgeable investigators. They differed in the type of knowledge they possessed rather than the amount. And like that's a really beautiful way to kind of merge these two worlds together. But in the practice, again, to get to my point, that doesn't really play out as easily as it sounds like it should, where giving this autonomy to these people would allow them to take the work done breeding and apply it to the milpa system or however they're farming in their community. So I'm curious, I want to hear some of your thoughts or reflections, I guess, now having written the book and probably gotten a lot of feedback and maybe done more research.
Yeah, I think it boils down to what you're pointing to, even with this question, has more to do with sovereignty and sovereignty in general than it does to do with a particular conservation strategy or way of organizing scientific research. That the fundamental challenge of sustaining communities, whether they are culturally distinct communities or people who have come together for different reasons, but who wish to pursue diets, lifestyles, other ways of being separate, not even separate from, but just, kind of their own choosing, right? And so I think many indigenous peoples around the world, they rightly articulate that what is required in order for their not just sort of sustaining, but flourishing in the way that we should want all people to flourish is greater access to and control over land that was historically their land. The foundation of sovereignty is in many ways a sovereignty over place. And that along with that, the decision to be sowing whatever seeds one deems most appropriate and to be benefiting from programs that purport to be working in the public interest that are also developing the seeds and the crops that they wish to be growing, so long as that's also what they would like to have happen. And so I see it's reflected in the international peasant movement via Campesina. One of their central campaign pillars is seed sovereignty. Comes back to this issue that we were talking about earlier about intellectual property over seeds. So the seed sovereignty issue is really one in which the ever increasing kind of extent of the umbrella that transnational industry has in terms of encompassing ownership of seed genetic material. There has been a struggle since the 1970s to keep that at bay. And the seed sovereignty movement that you may have heard about today is really one component of that. And it's the component involved or associated with indigenous and peasant communities. So yeah, I think that there's no easy answer to your question about the research program or the breeding program, because I think ultimately those are going to be superficial. That the real problems are much deeper, and that they are serious political issues about sovereignty and social justice that governments around the world need to be addressing better than they are right now.
Yeah. I would absolutely agree with that, and unfortunately I don't have a whole lot of hope that that's going to happen in the near future. But it does point to the fact that we can, one of the shortfalls in I think the social science arena is that we think we can almost policy wonk in terms of how we treat and discern the challenges that exist around these things into fixing them without addressing those core fundamental issues of, well, why do the campesina farmers need to try to change things? What is going on that's causing these folks to have to go work in the city? Or in the example in the book that you give, he joins the military and he isn't able to grow the crops that he had partnered with the researchers to test and see if they would fit for his MILPA system. And those are problems that changing how we relate to one another as researchers or farmers isn't going to solve, because there's a fundamental economic piece that's driving a wedge between a real viable solution. That's probably a bigger question for another day, unless you want to.
Well, what I think it's important to recognize the limitations of some of the interventions that we, for example, as academics, thinking from my own perspective, try and make within larger social structures that have deeply ingrained inequalities, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the work that we can do at a certain scale, and that there isn't a sort of desirability to always push forward. But I think it also means attending to the larger structures that shape, not just farming, but everyday life for all of us, and that really constrain opportunities for many people unjustly. And so there needs to be an awareness of that. And I suppose, yes, also the conversations about how to redress those structural injustices. Yeah. Yeah. And that fundamentally, I think there are ways in which one could imagine it. I think there's a lot of great research that's coming out right now. This is specific to the United States, but about historical racism in terms of USDA programs, funding, support, and the extent to which Black farmers in the United States have really suffered from the discrimination, specifically within a specific federal agency, right? And so we might think, well, what does redress of that historic wrong look like? What are the programs we should put in place to counterbalance the racism that the institution has historically shown? And that would be a meaningful way to think about some of these more structural issues. Not at a global scale, but at the scale of a quite powerful entity, right? That shapes some of these landscapes and issues that we've been talking about today.
And this really drives home the point that we're in the process of learning how to deal with these issues, and without addressing them fundamentally, we're not going to make the significant headway we want to. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of gets underscored in the entire book. Hopefully, if people have enjoyed this conversation, they can go grab it. So with all this with all this research we've done and kind of your understanding of corn as it exists today as a crop, where are we in 20 years, 30 years? In the book you talk quickly about the Texas male sterile breeding project and the impact it had when there was issues because of having this giant monocrop and how it impacted corn productivity for a while, and there was basically a shortage. Now, is that something that we should be worried about going forward into the future, or do you think it sounds like you're really optimistic about some of the genetics research? Where are we in 20 years?
Well, historians are notoriously bad at forecasting. Looking over our shoulders, we've got that down. Looking forward to the future, much harder. So one thing to say about the crop diversity issue in particular, I spoke a bit about there being a plant breeding bottleneck in which you see these sort of winnowing of diversity. But our knowledge of genetics has actually, I think, been such that in some crops, there has actually been a broadening out again in recent decades of crop diversity as researchers and breeders get better at using extant diversity in breeding programs. And so that's, in a way, in that very narrow issue of crop diversity, slightly encouraging, as I think there are many people now who are interested in the very challenging to name category of either neglected or forgotten crops, crops which are neither neglected nor forgotten. It just depends on what perspective you're looking from, but these are terms that generally refer to those that haven't been subject to as much breeding and research attention. But I think actually there is quite a bit of energy now among crop scientists and specialists and breeders in working with things that are, for example, crops that are more climate resilient. So some millets, other grain crops that we don't currently put a lot of energy into researching and developing, but actually might do much better in hotter, drier climates. And those kinds of initiatives focused on bringing new crops to the table, as it were, or old crops to new tables. That's probably a better way of saying it. That the fact that there are those conversations and that there is that research happening, I think should be encouraging. We have incredible knowledge of plant genetics and incredible tools for working with crops, both genetic engineering and editing, but also more traditional techniques. And so to answer your question, I think if we put our resources into responsible use of those tools, I think towards public funding of research to produce crops that maybe address a wider range of social needs and aspirations and demands than maybe we do right now, there would be, I think, good reason to be kind of optimistic, right? We could go in interesting directions and probably good ones in terms of sustainability, social and ecological. I think the probably more realistic side of me sees that it's very hard to think of a way out of some of the dominance of transnational capital in decision-making in agriculture. And that unless we build up, for example, public programs or reduce some of the intellectual property possibilities that there are in agricultural development right now, things will not go down a pathway where a wider range of interests are served and therefore, more possibilities are out on the table. And instead, we will continue down the pathway that we've been going down. Hopefully that provides some answer to that question.
Yeah, it does. I am probably with you on the pragmatic side of things, that I don't doubt that we will continue to see half of our plates, proverbially speaking, being corn or some corn byproduct, even if there are, as you said, many old crops that could fill a lot of those spaces and provide some diversity in both our diets and some diversity in the landscape. But it's possible.
It is possible. And I think that's really important to recognize, right? Like the decision isn't any one of ours individually, but collectively it is, right? It is there.
Now, for folks that want to get your book, I know you've also got another book that you released a few years ago. I don't know if you want to plug them, if you've got any new stuff coming, social media, all that good stuff.
Sure. I'm on Twitter at HA Curry, but my books are Evolution Made to Order, which is a book about the history of early genetic technologies and the aspirations that researchers had from there. And that's available from the University of Chicago Press. And of course, we've been talking about Endangered Maize, which covers the history of crop genetic conservation through the history of corn. And that's available from the University of California Press.
Awesome. Helen, thanks so much. This has been fantastic. I could talk about corn all day.
So could I, believe me.
So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it.